This timeline is pretty easy to start. The Turks simply choose to not get involved in the First World War, which was the war that resulted in their destruction and the partition of the empire by the Europeans. The Ottoman Empire was a relatively pro-German state, but also had British sympathies. The pro-British faction was crushed by Britain requisitioning 2 ships the Turks had ordered from British manufacturers for their own war effort. The Ottoman Minister of War, Enver Pasha, was pro-German and organized a deal with the Germans, in which the Germans gave them 2 ships, the Guben and Breslau, from their Mediterranean fleet, to which the Turks opened the Dardanelles Straits to bombard the Russians in the Black Sea. After this, they reverted Turkish control. This dragged the Turks into the war. This never occurs in this timeline, and the rest of the Turkish government denies the German passage to the Dardanelles and steers clear of the war. Many powers try to court Turkey to their side, but the Turks stay neutral. The Turks were a net gain for the Central Powers in our timeline, tying down the Allied forces in Gallipoli, Palestine, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia. And since the Central Powers still lost in our timeline, they would still lose in this world. The Turks would be in an excellent situation with the collapse of Central Russian authority in 1918. They would invade the Caucasus in an effort to seize Azerbaijan and unite with their Turkic brothers. With Russian authority painfully weak due to the Russian Civil War, they would seize the southern slope of the Caucasus and modern nations like Armenia and Azerbaijan. There would be no Armenian genocide in this timeline, since the Armenian genocide was caused by fear that the Armenians would side with the Russians in case of a Russian invasion, and with no threat of a Russian invasion, thus the Armenian genocide would not occur. Greater Armenia would survive alongside other Christian groups that were victimized like the Assyrians. Lots of people think that if the Ottoman Empire didn't fall apart in World War I, it would immediately fall apart afterwards due to internal divisions. I wholeheartedly disagree, since A, the Ottomans were going through an incredible process of reforms in this era to modernize and westernize the nation. B, a lot of oil was just discovered in this region, which would make it one of the most valuable areas of the world. C, multi-ethnic empires are the norm in this region of the world. Let me break down each of these claims. In our timeline, World War I vaulted Ataturk from a minor officer in exactly the right place to the supreme commander of the Turkish nation in 5 years. This was since Ataturk was continually able to demonstrate his incredible abilities on the battlefield. However, in a world where this never occurs, Ataturk will likely still rise to power, just due to sheer raw talent, but it would still take several decades for him to work his way through a peacetime government. In our timeline, Ataturk is famous for making a series of reforms that completely transformed Turkey, transforming it from a more traditional Islamic empire to a more of a modern European-facing nation, which is why Mustafa Kemal was given the name Ataturk, or Father of the Turks. What many people fail to realize is that the political party that ran the Ottoman Empire before Ataturk's seizure of power, the Young Turks, were instituting reforms at an incredible clip. Almost all of Ataturk's ideas were ideas that came from the Young Turks playbook. A big deciding factor is not having the Turkish War of Independence, which was in our timeline after World War I. The Greeks invaded Turkey and made it nearly all the way to Ankara before being wiped out by Ataturk. If the Turkish nation in this timeline would be shook enough to institute the reforms Ataturk did, and without Ataturk's sheer force of personality in the lead, would Turkey have the same reforms as early? I'm guessing that the Young Turks would do a lot of Ataturk's reforms in the 1920s, while Ataturk would probably get into power himself in the 1930s and do a lot of the rest. However, there would be exceptions. Losing World War I and nearly losing the Turkish War of Independence in our timeline made the Turks lose a lot of faith in their own civilization, which allowed parts of Ataturk's reforms. I'm guessing that the reformers, including Ataturk, are no longer able to get rid of the Caliph. This was an enormous move and hugely controversial, the equivalent of getting rid of the Pope in the Catholic world. Similarly, some other overtly pro-Western stuff, like banning the hijab or changing the Turkish language to the Latin alphabet, would never take place. Another very important variable, which, as said before, that the Turks would discover an incredible amount of oil in areas like Saudi Arabia and Iraq. However, some of the wealthiest and tiny Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Kuwait were under British control. With this ridiculous amount of oil money, the Turks would have unending funds for modernization. The oil money would provide unending funds which the Turkish regime would plow into industrializing the country. Turkey's industrialization would be several decades earlier in this timeline. In our timeline, the collapse of Ottoman power on the coasts allowed minor chieftain named Abdulaziz ibn Saud was able to seize control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and gain control of most of the Arabian Peninsula. The Ottomans outclassed the Arabs by nearly every metric, and without the total collapse of their power, would have been able to maintain control of the Arab Peninsula. In fact, once they realized the Saudis were sitting on a lot of oil, they'd probably wipe them out and seize the region. Thus, there never would be Saudi Arabia in this timeline. This would have a really good effect in the whole region, since the Saudis, with their vast oil revenue, have been able to fund their radical branch of Islam, or Wahhabism. When Westerners think of the worst, most intolerant sections of Islam, ISIS, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, they are all derived from the Wahhabist tradition, with all those groups receiving Saudi money. With the Ottomans as moderate Muslims, none of this would come to be. A big reason people say the Ottoman Empire could never have survived is due to ethnic divisions. This ignores the Arab sections of their empire hadn't been ruled by locals since 539 BC and the Babylonian Empire. Meanwhile, all the empires in this region are multi-ethnic, since the ethnic groups are so mixed together. Saying that the Middle East needs to have ethno-states, well, there are successful pluralistic ones like Canada, South Africa, Belgium, or Singapore, is one of the ways it's okay to be racist in our society today, by holding Muslims to much lower standards than the rest of the world. The Turks are hard rulers, and so could have dominated the Arab sections of their empire with a moderate amount of terror. World War II is difficult to figure out in this timeline. You wonder if the Turks would view their neutrality in World War I in a positive or negative light. They might have the prescience and wisdom to realize that they would have lost, but pumped up by industrialization or nationalism, might have delusionally believed they could have won. In the original script of this video, I had the Turks siding with the Axis and seizing Egypt, Sudan, the Middle East, Western Iran, and the Caucasus, forming a greater Islamic empire. I decided against this, partially since I realized Turkish leadership would probably be wise enough to know that they were in an early enough stage of industrialization that they'd be putting themselves in a world of danger in an age of mechanized warfare. Also, they'd be able to make a ridiculous amount of money selling oil to both sides. I don't think Turkey would get invaded either, with the Russians and Germans knowing that the other was their main rival, and that a major war would get them bogged down in the Anatolian or Caucasus mountains, which would leave them vulnerable, while most of the Ottomans' oil supply was on the other side of the mountains in the Arab section of the empire. World War II takes a similar direction. The main exception is that in the fall of 1942, rather than go after Stalingrad, which is the way to get to the Azeri oil fields in the Caucasus, which would be under Turkish rather than Russian control in this timeline, the Germans go after Moscow instead. This would likely result in similar results, the Russian winter, sheer space, and the courage of the Red Army creating the same exact thing. World War II would have a similar ending, with the Reds and Anglos dividing Europe down the middle. Industrialization happens on a civilizational and cultural basis. We've had two waves of industrialization so far. In the first, your level of industrialization was determined by how culturally close to Britain you were. In the second, by how close to Japan you were. In my live streams, I say that in 50 to 100 years, I think the Islamic world will be one of the dominant world powers. People say I'm insane, but I say this since Turkey and Iran, to a lesser extent, have industrialized, and so in a couple decades, we should expect something similar in other Muslim countries as they follow those countries' leads. With Turkey industrializing earlier in this timeline, they would also industrialize their colonial empire. The Arabs that would comprise a majority of the empire's population would form cheap labor, and so Turkish factories would relocate to Iraq and Syria once factories in Anatolia had become too expensive. Also, it seems likely that the mercantile peoples of the empire, like The Lebanese, Armenians, and Jews would benefit disproportionately from this success. Also, with Turkey industrializing earlier, other Muslim regions around the world like Algeria and Pakistan would better be able to follow the Turkish model and be in a better position in this timeline. However, there would inevitably be a crisis with the Arab sections of the empire. As modernization would improve, the Arabs would feel stronger connections between each other and seethe under Turkish control. Similarly to our timeline, the Arab section of the empire would fall behind the Turkish section and be poorer, which would also add resentment. However, this region has always been ruled by foreign governments, and so I don't see why the last 70 years should be an exception. The Turks would respond to the Arab discontent with brutal tactics and carrot and stick politics, pulling the local leadership into the Turkish fold. At least with industrialization, the massive population growth rate seen in the Arab world in our timeline could be integrated into a developed urban economy that could keep up. The Turks would deal with the multi-ethnic issues of their empire by positioning themselves as the leaders of the Islamic world. They would position themselves as a pan-Islamic empire that happened to be run by the Turks rather than a Turkish colonial empire, although in many ways it still would be. In many ways, the results of this timeline line up very well with Islam's traditional position in history. The Islamic world has been in general dominated by huge empires, with Arabs as a majority, but with some mountain people as the leadership, with Islam as the glue holding the empire together. The Islamic world would likely still be technologically behind the West, but the gap would be smaller and the Islamic world would be catching up much faster. The Turks, positioning themselves as the profoundly conservative arbiters of Islam and terrified of the Soviets inflaming the Arabs, would ally with the Americans after World War II. This would further integrate Turkey into the Western system, and the Turks would further continue their industrialization with Western financing and consulting. Most Arab countries today should not be countries. I don't mean this as a moral judgment, merely a practical one. Countries like Iraq and Libya exist since they were convenient for European governments, while Egypt and Syria before the 1950s hadn't been run by their own native populations for 2,500 years. People give the US a lot of crap for being an imperialist power, but the only reason countries like this, and I'm putting the Africans in this category, exist is that in the global world order created after World War II was based upon the Americans and the UN, although they had no real power, destroying anyone who would try to conquer their neighbors. Turkey, after passing a certain threshold of power and after the European colonial powers would decolonize, thus leaving Turkey by far the most powerful country in the area, would want to conquer their neighbors, but this was not allowed in the post-World War II global system, and so would instead gain more and more soft power inside the Islamic world. Turkish forces would reinstall stability in Somalia, Turkish businessmen would run the Egyptian economy, and Turkish assassins would kill Gaddafi, and if all else failed, they'd still have the Ottoman bomb. On a bizarre side note, Israel is really interesting in this timeline in that after the Holocaust, the creation of the Jewish state would seem absolutely necessary, but with Palestine under Turkish control, that could never take place. An alternative that was proposed that would likely make sense would be the settling of the Jews in the lightly populated highlands of Kenya. This would take place in this timeline, and this would have the strange effect of having the British white settler elite work with the Jews to keep the black Kenyans down. The Jews would become nearly half of the total population of Kenya at this time, while Kenya, with such a large white population, would continue to be a beacon for white immigration from Britain. However, with African population growth rates what they are, there's no way Kenya could remain a majority white state for long, and Kenya would double down as a white supremacist state. The million-dollar question is whether the white population would deal with the black one by integrating them into society or becoming harsher with apartheid-like measures. Back in the Middle East, the moderate Sunni Turks would be unable to accept the seizure of power in Iran by radical Shia clerics in the 1970s, thus displacing the docile pro-Western monarch that came before, and like Saddam Hussein, would invade Iran. However, the Turkish military would almost certainly be miles better than Saddam's, and they would defeat Iran's cannon fodder armies and replace the government in Tehran with a moderate Shia pro-Western one. Iran has immense potential. It is a very well-educated population with a well-functioning society and a very good geographic position. The second the Ayatollahs lose power in Iran, Iran will become a second-rate power, and a few decades later will become an industrial powerhouse. This would happen in this timeline, with Iran industrializing like Turkey. Iran would likely remain in their ancestral position of rivals to the Turks and would be allies of whoever was Turkey's enemy. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the Turkic Central Asian republics would fall into the Ottoman Empire's sway. Their trade would be brought into Turkey's focus through Azerbaijan. These countries would receive Turkish funding and become strong Turkish allies. With such a massive region under its influence, Turkey would verge on being a superpower. We would likely see a conflict in Central Asia between Turkish, Chinese, and to a lesser extent Russian influence, with the Chinese having immense amounts of money and a larger economy than Turkey, but the Turks having stronger cultural affinities. China's control and occupation of their Turkic Uyghur minority would almost certainly turn them into a Turkish enemy. With the Turks in charge, the Middle East would almost certainly be more stable. The region would be industrializing and rising in power. There would be no ISIS, 9/11, Saddam Hussein, Khomeini, or the like. There would never be the massive wave of migrants that washed into Europe, with jobs to those people at home and no conflicts. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for more. Or alternatively, check out my Patreon, where I've got the first 3 chapters of my history of the world, as well as all sorts of cool maps. As always, thank you for watching, and have a great day. I'm back. Hi, I'm back. For those of you who don't know, and the new viewers out there, I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail. It's been incredibly long, but also character building, and it's been difficult the whole way. But here I am, and I've returned. I went close to half the total distance, and then I realized that there really wasn't any point to keep going, because I was doing it for self-improvement, and I felt that returning back to the internet and showers and making videos for you guys would be much more good to me. And so I have returned, and also this is my first face reveal video. That doesn't really matter much to me, and I choose not to overhype it and make it all the whole clickbait thing, but I'm sure it'll matter to many of you. For those of you who guessed that I was a young, white, North American, nerdly male, congratulations. For those of you who had not, I give you the award of being unperceptive. Gather round, for a tale of atrocity and terror, of oppression and blood. We've all heard of the Atlantic slave trade, a truly massive movement, moving millions of people across the Atlantic Ocean from the west coast of Africa to the cash-crop fields of the New World. Its presence is felt even today, as the 12 million Africans brought in the migration created majority black nations in the New World, and even
Something like
majority black oftentimes have large African minorities. And so it really begs the question, how much did the Atlantic slave trade affect the world in which we currently live today? And what would a world in which it never occurred look like? What would borders, culture, politics, war, and everything else be like in this new changed world? That is the question of this alternate history. Unlike many other alternate histories, like what if the South won the Civil War, or what if the Nazis won World War II, there's no big battle or big event that you can point to say that that is the point where if things had gone differently, the Atlantic slave trade would have never happened. However, there definitely were cruxes in history where if things had gone differently, then the Atlantic slave trade would never have happened. And there definitely were people who, if they did the right thing, the slave
Got a
trade
nice
would be
looking
ended.
base. We're
And this
doing
is
pretty.
because Europe in this era really did not have slavery. Christianity and the Catholic Church did not condone the practice, and so from the end of the Roman Empire until the 11th century, it had been phased out. And actually, William the Conqueror, the Norman conqueror of England, at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and all that, was actually a huge enemy of the slave trade and stamped it out in England. And most people during the Middle Ages were tenant farmers or serfs. And today we tend to confuse the two terms, but actually there's a world of difference. Being a serf means around 10% or more of your crop goes to your lord, and your lord decides whether or not you can marry outside of his estate or leave his estate, and you have to spend a certain allotted amount of days working for your lord. Meanwhile, being a slave means every aspect of you, whether physical, mental, sexual, or economic, is
I think
owned
it's
by the
not. I don't
Lord,
think it's connected.
and that you have about the same amount of legal rights as a horse or a pack mule. And if you told a Christian European around the year 1450 that the future of a European Western society would be slavery, they'd likely be shocked. So, what allowed slavery to develop in the New World? A couple things. Firstly, the lack of population in settler societies can result in two separate effects. The first of which is that they can be freer. In some settler societies, the lack of population
A lot of
density
room
and
for
stable
automation
governmental
here.
conditions allows the individual to be much freer than they would be back in their home culture. And this happened in America with the cowboys, the Paulistas in Brazil, the Russian Cossacks, and even the Icelandic Vikings back in the Middle Ages. However, this creates issues if you want to maintain the same level of government, sophistication, culture, capital that you would have in your home country, because all of these free societies collapse into near
Wrapping
barbarism and end up
around here.
starving because they just don't have the resources for that. Well, if you want to be able to do that, then you have to resort to slavery. And this is especially appealing if you're a feudal lord or an aristocrat where you want to maintain the same standard of living as the old country, and so you enslave people to deal with that. And we saw this throughout the entirety of the Americas with both African, native, and even some European slaves. And we saw this in Russia with their massive serf system that survived into the 19th century, and some people even suspect it's the origin of the caste system in India. The way we could have prevented the Atlantic slave trade from developing would be that someone powerful in the 16th century would have had to have made the conscious moral stance that the enslavement of Africans and slavery in general in the New World was morally wrong. And since the founding nations of the Atlantic slave trade were Spain and to a lesser extent Portugal, both Catholic nations, it would make sense that if the Pope could have made a conscious moral stance about it, that something could have been done. So just imagine in the 16th century that there had been a Pope who had made it his life's work to prevent the Atlantic slave trade from developing. And he had issued edicts and bulls saying that slavery in the New World was wrong. An interesting example to look at would be the enslavement of natives in the New World. The Spanish, when they first
Hmm.
arrived, enslaved massive numbers of the indigenous population for their own purposes. However, a combination of the papacy and the Spanish crown had lowered
There
the
we go.
status from slaves to
Yeah, crank
serfs.
those out.
And so
Okay.
by the time of independence, a full-blood indigenous person actually had far more rights than a mixed race person. And so we can imagine something similar in which the combination of the papacy and the crowns of Iberia could have prevented African slavery from growing out of a conscious moral decision. And with the Catholic nations in line, the Protestant nations wouldn't want the Catholic nations to appear morally superior. And so
Still.
the nations like Britain and Holland would not have done slavery either, as it wouldn't be part of what was morally acceptable in that
One,
society.
two,
Many
three.
of you are going to argue that the Atlantic slave trade was necessary because of the goods produced. I mean, how would you live without sugar, tobacco, and coffee? All things you're addicted to. However, the real tragedy of the Atlantic slave trade was that it produced things no one needed, luxuries. People in the Middle Ages lived without all of those things and cotton, which I'm hoping you're not freakishly addicted to somehow, perfectly happily, and never even considered all those products. All of these things we think we need because because we're so used to them because slaves made them. I like to cook a lot, and I do a fair amount of medieval cooking and the cooking of medieval recipes. And it's really interesting how different their philosophy of cooking is from ours, because they didn't have any of the substances that I mentioned before. And so the only real way to make food more interesting in northern medieval Europe was to add more fat, and spice if you were really wealthy, so with small amounts of sugar. For example, one pie I made had beef, duck, egg, butter, and gravy all mixed together. Now that's a lot of juicy goodness. Western cuisine moved from an emphasis on mixing all sorts of tastes together, the pillar most world cuisines are built upon, to a concentration of powerful tastes, like sweetness, savory, salty, etc. This is why Chinese cuisine has sweet and sour chicken, what you would never see that in the West today. That medieval pie I was talking about also had spices and dried fruits to balance out the fats and meats involved, which is similar to what Chinese cooking philosophy is. This was allowed to happen in the West's change towards more direct tastes because Europe had slave labor that allowed the production of large amounts of flavors like sugar and caffeine. This is why so few non-European nations have strong dessert cultures. This emphasis on concentration of flavor in turn resulted in the production of more of these flavors. Thus, in a roundabout way, a world that forbade the Atlantic slave trade would not miss the results and would probably think that our cuisine was made in bad taste.
Iron plate, gear wheels.
In this timeline, the Western societies would still have sugar and coffee and chocolate because everyone who can get those eats them to a certain extent. However, the production would be smaller because the demands would be smaller. That would also mean that the plantations involved would be smaller, rarer, and more unstable. The workers involved would likely be a combination of European and indigenous, with a minuscule number of African indentured servant labor toiling slowly in the fields to produce minuscule amounts of each of these substances. If you want to make some of these cash crops, it's absolutely brutal. And if you want to grow crops like sugar and coffee, vast parts of your workforce will die if you try to get them to work quickly due to the heat and the disease involved. And so without cheap, expendable African labor, that would not happen. This
I just
timeline
have
is
like a
really hard to
fucking
make chronologically.
grabber
And so instead,
putting
I'll focus on
extra
different regions of the world
shit.
individually and then bring it all together for the finale of how the entire world would be different.
Put it into some fucking chests.
The region affected most by the Atlantic slave trade was the Caribbean, in which most of the nations are majority black. Barbados and Jamaica are both 92% black, and Haiti is 95%.
I need
This
science.
is mainly because this region is perfect for growing sugar. Sugar, as mentioned before, is a very labor-intensive and often lethal crop that made massive amounts of money, so there was both the demand and the money to have huge numbers of slaves. The native peoples of the Caribbean were all wiped out in the first few decades of the 16th century, meaning that in this timeline the Caribbean would probably become majority white. This was actually developing in our timeline. In Barbados, the English had a strong tobacco-growing middle class.
So many goddamn things to.
Both the Bahamas and Jamaica were bases for raiding the Spanish galleons. The area that became Haiti were inhabited by Spanish hunters called buccaneers, who hunted the pilferal pigs in the area and sold them to the Spanish authorities and galleons passing by. They invented barbecue, with their word for the style of cured meats they cooked being boucan, or the kind of crate they used to cook their meats. The Spanish tried to get rid of them by killing their pigs and by cutting down the forest. This just resulted in the buccaneers, as they came to call themselves, turn to the sea and become pirates. Strangely, they even developed homosexual unions called the Brothers of the Coast due to the lack of women. I could talk all day about pirates, and I would love to have you guys recommend pirate alternate histories, but sadly, this video is not about piracy, and so this pirate accent will end. The Spanish referred to the Caribbean as the Useless Islands because it only really existed for the Spanish as a stopping point to get to their more important colonies like Mexico and Peru, and Havana was their big center for resupply
Lights on.
galleon routes across the Atlantic. And the whole Spanish strategy of enslave the native population and live like lords back home failed in the Caribbean, and so the entire native population was wiped out, and the region was really lightly settled until black slaves were brought in to replace the indigenous population. The white population in the Caribbean would grow, although not
There we go.
radically. The land just simply
Alright.
isn't very good if you're trying
So you
to
just
grow
come up here.
anything
Pop, pop,
except
pop, pop,
sugar.
pop, pop.
And it's kind of similar to the issues that were faced in our timeline by the British colonies of New
Now I
Zealand,
wanna.
Africa, and Australia, in each of which the land quality is worse than North America, so they always had to play second fiddle for immigrants and thus always received less white immigration than North America. This would happen to the Caribbean in our timeline
There
with
we
the
go.
British. For the French, meanwhile, their only other options to export their white population would be the swamps of Louisiana and the frozen wastes of Canada. So the French colonies in the Caribbean would receive a larger percentage of their French immigration, but at the same time the French exported far fewer people than the British, and so it would all balance out in the end, except Haiti would have a fairly high population density as underpopulated French colonies go. Meanwhile, the Spanish exported very few people after the early 16th century to their colonies, mostly because the local social hierarchies didn't want more white Spaniards to come in and disturb the position the previous white Spanish Creole population, as they called themselves, had. Meanwhile, Spain was losing population very quickly due to a combination of plagues and fighting everyone in Europe at once in wars, and so didn't really have much excess population to send to the colonies. So the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean would remain very lightly populated. The light population density and bad soil would result in most of the Caribbean's economy being based around herding and small-scale agriculture. This is like New Zealand, the South African Cape, and Australia in our timeline, all of which were stuck in the same predicament. The lack of good soil prevented there from being enough income to create an industrial economy, which prevented there from being more immigration, which keeps everyone on square one for much longer. In general, New Zealand on a smaller scale is a pretty good model for how these tropical islands would develop. And don't get me wrong, New Zealand is a really great country, but it's not exactly a historically important or fabulously wealthy society. In our timeline, the Americas were pretty disease-free before Columbus. There are a few possible exceptions, but when the Europeans arrived, they had a massive disease advantage over the native population. And that's most of the reason for why the European conquest succeeded. However, on the other hand, it meant that the American tropical civilizations were able to thrive beautifully, while they oftentimes hit disease issues inside the Old World. Well, meanwhile, Africa is one of the most diseased areas on the planet. It was practically impossible for non-African explorers to get more than a few miles past the coast into the interior without dying of disease before 100 years ago and modern medicine came in. And in our timeline, the import of African slaves into the New World and their diseases meant that parts of the American tropics became nearly as deadly as the African tropics. And so this involved the import of more African slaves to deal with the diseases that only they had the immunities against. And so this resulted in a cascading effect and a major population shift inside the American tropics. In this timeline, it would be much healthier for Europeans and the indigenous population inside the American tropics,
Like the
and
red
this
circuit,
shift would have
copper
happened
cable,
significantly
circuit,
later or
plastic
never
bar. So I
happened
need to run
at
plastic
all.
bars
The colony that imported
down
the
here.
highest number of slaves was Portuguese Brazil, and because of that, Brazil has become a multiracial society in which the descendants of the slaves and the Europeans mix to become the majority group. And
Battery.
Brazil's economy in the colonial era was entirely dependent upon slavery,
What does it
whether
take
that
to
was
make a
in the
battery?
giant
Sulfur?
coffee and
Sulfuric
sugar
acid.
plantations or in the enormous diamond and gold mines. And
Made
our
in the
timeline in
chemical
Brazil
plant.
had become dependent on cheap labor for most of its history due to that very reason, and a colonial Brazil without slavery is almost impossible to imagine. Slavery is very detrimental to stable free societies. This is because of the enormous concentration of labor and capital means that it puts small businesses and workers out of the markets. This means that even among the free population, there's far less social mobility and equality. This lack of opportunities means that there's actually less immigration as well, which means the population grows more slowly. Slave societies almost never have a strong emphasis on education, because what they aspire to is a docile, uneducated, cheap labor source. And so that also adds up as well, and most of the money is poured back into the slave system, and so there's less extra income for industrialization and commercialization. This process occurred in the American South, South Africa, Brazil, and Latin America as a whole, and to free Brazil in this timeline would have a much more dynamic economy. Without African diseases, it would also be healthier for European farmers than it would be in our timeline, and so the massive land and resources of Brazil would be a huge beacon for European immigrants. It's kind of become a meme on this channel of how consistently disappointed I am in Brazil, and the really sad thing is how many of my Brazilian fans actually agree. But I genuinely think that without slavery, Brazil would be able to reach its full potential. The Brazil of this timeline would be a superpower. In this world, many small farmers would settle the fertile regions of Brazil, spending their income on improving their equipment and thus raising their economies and societies. This would in turn drag up the economy of the whole region. In the same way, Mexico and Central America has a lot of trade with America and thus gains a lot of income that way, both through legal and illegal trade. Nations like Argentina, Bolivia, and the like would receive large amounts of exchange with the Brazilian economy and thus influence. The first thing you need to understand about Anglo-North American slavery is that it was caused by pre-existing events rather than being a cause in of itself. Most of the American lowland South was settled by the second sons of English nobility, who wanted to be able to have old world style estates with serfs just like back home. However, this resulted in issues in America in which much of the indigenous population had already been wiped out by
Jeez, that
European
fucking map is
colonization,
huge.
and at the same time, the European immigrants really were not keen about becoming a serf just like back home because they could just get their own land further west. This meant to support the pre-existing culture, black slaves were imported in from Africa. Without this cheap labor, the lowland southern culture we saw in our timeline would simply collapse. This
Where's
would
the
mean
batteries?
America's aristocratic side, including figures such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, would simply not exist. The South would mainly be small farmers raising crops like tobacco, hogs, and corn. The South soil actually isn't very good compared to that of the Midwest, and so we might see the agricultural style of Appalachia predominate across the whole South, with hogs combined with small fields and foraging, basically turning the American South into a giant Afghanistan for several hundred years. This would make the American South desperately poor. Without slavery, the American South, and especially the lowland South, would be much poorer and more lightly settled. The climate is simply much less healthy for European Americans than it is in the North, and so there wouldn't be much incentive without the tropical cash crops to settle in the American lowland South.
Oh wait.
And this would result in greatly weakening the South's power culturally and politically inside America. However, it would be great news for the native tribes. In our timeline, there were powerful tribes in the southeast like the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Chickasaw, and these were part of what were called the Seven Civilized Tribes, which were able to adapt to European technology and custom with greater ease than the other native peoples, and they were only barely evicted from their land in our timeline. And so in this timeline, with less pressure and attention in the southern lands, they likely remain a large minority in the region with a large amount of political power and clout. Without the
Whoa.
South being a large cultural, economic, and political force for much of America's history, the United States would be much more homogenous and
I
much
don't know
more
what any
to
of these do.
Australia culturally, because the North would just be able to do whatever the hell it wanted. And at the same time, the United States would also likely be a much more left-wing and socialistic nation, with politics more like Canada in our world. The ex-slave states have been conservative on practically every issue imaginable, thus slowing down social change in every department. Also, almost all social programs in America become poisoned by some form of racial tension. Part of the reason social programs are so distrusted in America is they end up getting viewed as economic redistribution between ethnic groups that aren't exactly keen on each other. Race and class are inextricably linked in America, and this plays against people's natural tribalism. This is why all the nations with large welfare systems are fairly homogenous. When people think their welfare payments are going to pay for their grandmother or their deadbeat cousin, they're much more accepted. The South, just like in our timeline, would become quite wealthy in recent years as air conditioning, modern medicine, cheap non-union wages, and a lack of regulation would mean that businesses would relocate to it from the overtaxed and overregulated northern states, just like in our timeline with the Sun Belt. The United States would likely be more anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish. In general, each society has to have some group that they dislike, and I'm sure lots of folks will say, my society doesn't, and we're completely tolerant. but in general, in that case, it's either the other party or foreigners. And for the United States, it's mainly been the blacks, who have on average been the most downtrodden group. And white Protestants could always remark about Jews and Catholics that at least they aren't black, and so the Jews and the Catholics got a better deal. But in this timeline, that likely would not be the case. And as a Canadian, I can tell you this process definitely did happen in Canada until recently. And so in this timeline, the Jews and Catholics would take longer to assimilate, and the United States would likely have prevented more Southern Europeans and Jews from migrating in at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The US would have annexed less of the Southwest from Mexico during the Mexican-American War in this timeline. This is because if you're doing northern-style cattle and milk and grain-style agriculture, this area is nigh useless. However, if you are having a southern-style cotton agriculture, it's remarkably useful. And so in this timeline, cities like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Phoenix would just be part of Mexico. As an American, I always assumed that the effects of the Atlantic slave trade were mostly in the New World. However, as I read African history, I realized that you can't take 12 million people out of a continent with 34 million in it and expect no changes to happen. The largest trend inside Africa caused by the Atlantic slave trade was the movement of people and power and wealth from the interior of Africa to the coasts. And this was caused because the Europeans put their forts on the African coast, and they subcontracted local coastal African tribes to go into the interior to get slaves for them. And so this resulted in the weakening of the previously powerful Sahel states of North Central Africa, and every high school history teacher's favorite Mali and Songhai empires, and resulted in their decline to the coast. The second major geopolitical effect of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa was the introduction of guns and gunpowder into the region. And this had the effect of producing a nasty series of wars, in that local regimes would start wars to get slaves to trade into the Europeans to get gunpowder, and since their neighbors had guns, they needed to get more guns, so they'd start wars to get more slaves to keep up the competition. And this had the nasty effect of depopulating and devastating the whole region. And the nasty thing is it actually might have prevented this region from suffering too badly in the Mini Ice Age. And the Mini Ice Age was a period from around 1300 to 1800 in which the global climate was significantly cooler than today. And it was worse in the 17th century, and it was so bad actually that some historians think that a third of the whole world's population might have died off, due to basically every major country had a war and a nasty famine. But actually West Africa didn't suffer that badly, because it was already so depopulated from all these wars dealing with the Atlantic slave trade. And normally this area suffers bad droughts, and they did, but the population density was low enough that there actually wasn't massive famine, and the worst thing that happened was there was a jihad of some folks in the grasslands trying to attack south into the wetter tropical forests. Part of what allowed the African slave trade was the introduction of New World crops like corn into West Africa, which increased the population density. This, combined with the Mini Ice Age, would mean that there would be many wars in this region, like there were in every other region of the world in the 17th century. The most common variation would likely be the raids and conquests of the Sahel grassland peoples south into the forests, and this would likely be masked as jihads against the pagan inhabitants of the forest. However, I don't think these wars would be as deadly and as detrimental as the Atlantic slave trade, because the aim of them would not be to destroy and depopulate whole regions of the area, and there would be less gunpowder because the Europeans would be trading less with this region because it wouldn't have a large commodity that the Europeans would trade guns for. I don't see why the European colonization of Africa that happened around the year 1900 would never have happened in this timeline. There's simply no way the Africans would have been able to bridge the technological gap that Europe had after industrialization and the invention of medicines that could deal with Africa's diseases. People like to claim that without the African slave trade, Europe never would have had its economic revolution and never would have risen to world predominance, with events like the Industrial Revolution never occurring. This stands up to no scrutiny. As I said before, slave societies themselves are poorer than non-slave societies, but what does that say about their mother nations? The Muslims had a much larger and longer slave trade with Africa, and that certainly did not have the effects we saw inside Europe. Also, inside Europe, the nation most involved in the Atlantic slave trade was Portugal, and they were dirt poor until recently. Meanwhile, Belgium, Germany, and much of Scandinavia had practically no involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, but they're some of the wealthiest and most successful areas in the whole world. Meanwhile, inside the United Kingdom, Bristol was the largest town in the slave trade, but the areas that kickstarted the Industrial Revolution were towns in the North Midlands like Sheffield, Leeds, and Manchester, although I must admit that Glasgow and Liverpool started out as slave trading stations and then later morphed into being industrial behemoths. In general, the belief that resources and success are correlated is just a fallacy. For example, nations like Nigeria and Iraq have a large amount of oil. Well, they're not doing very well. Well, meanwhile, Switzerland and Japan have practically nothing of value, but they're some of the wealthiest and most successful societies in the world. A general truth about societies and people in general is that if you give people wealth that they didn't earn with their own hands or brain, they're going to waste it. And that's what happens here, where most of the revenue from the Atlantic slave trade was spent by the nouveau riche to gain luxuries to make themselves appear like the old nobility. And there was a small group, almost entirely British, who did invest their income in their local economies and helped the Industrial Revolution. But the only area that really did have an Industrial Revolution during the slave trade was a small area in the northwest of England. Well, most of history has had slavery. And that's part of the tragedy of the Atlantic slave trade, in that millions of people were tortured and enslaved so that we could get goods that we didn't need that made us unhealthier, and much of the income of it was just frittered away, and the societies it built were stunted and warped for hundreds of years afterwards. The main central fact that just screams into this world is that Brazil is a power on par with the United States. In our timeline, the United States has been the unquestioned hegemon of the Western Hemisphere, and this has allowed the United States to project power beyond that hemisphere, and it's why the United States is doing drone strikes in Sudan, sending money to the polls, and has troops in the ground in Afghanistan. And that just wouldn't be the case in this timeline, where the Brazilians and the Americans would struggle over control of the Americas. The main conduit of American and Brazilian competition would be the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean, which I've heard some geopolitical analysts refer to as America's Mediterranean, because it's the central region by which the whole of the Americas revolve around geographically and geopolitically. With America's main threat being below it, it would make sense that the United States would annex Cuba. In our world, a majority of white Cuban landowners during the Cuban-American War wanted the United States to annex Cuba, and in this timeline, with this demographic being the majority, this might have been the case. However, in this world with a more anti-Catholic America, that might not be the case. It might be different. However, the United States would still likely annex Cuba due to its geographic importance and make it a state. And since it would be lightly populated, the United States would likely fill it with Anglos and make it a less trashy version of Florida. The British white states of the Caribbean would likely form a federation, as British white colonies have a tendency to do, and they would work side and side with their cousins the Americans to gain control of the Caribbean, and they would likely seize Spanish Hispaniola and turn French Haiti into a docile ally. There's no way the United States would support a Brazilian-aligned regime in Mexico, or a regime of any threat in Mexico, and so the United States would always support a puppet regime in Mexico City. However, the Mexicans, to gain some autonomy, would likely have
So
a
we're gonna
grassroots
go.
movement supported by Brazil. Like much of Latin American politics, this would likely take on a class distinction, with the Mexican-Brazilian grassroots movement likely taking on a peasant flair to it, while
Fucking.
meanwhile the Americans would support the status quo, which would be more stable in the aristocracy, that would fear that the peasants would take away their land grants. This would likely mean that there would be an American-supported regime in Mexico City, and always a guerrilla campaign that would have trouble being put down somewhere out in the provinces, that would be supported by the Brazilians. Okay, kids, are you prepared for my favorite game? Aligning various areas of the world for World War I, hundreds of years after my point of departure, and this time it's South America. To start, Paraguay and Uruguay have probably already been cannibalized by Brazil by now. Meanwhile, Argentina's got a large grudge against Brazil, and having a giant superpower enemy to the north might instill some fiscal responsibility inside the Argentines, but I doubt it. Meanwhile, Chile has got a large grudge against Argentina, so they would side with the Brazilians. Because of this, Argentina would side with the United States. Peru and Bolivia, angry from the War of the Pacific, would side against Chile with the United States. Meanwhile, Colombia, angry that the Americans took land for their Panama Canal, would side with Brazil. In general, the war would enter a scheme in which many small countries around Brazil would side against Brazil to hem in Brazil's power and prevent it from gaining complete control over the continent. In World War I, the United States and Brazil would be on opposing sides. The United States would likely side with Britain, its mother country, and thus the Entente. Meanwhile, Brazil would likely side with the Central Powers. The stupid number of people of Italian descent in Brazil might result in the Italians staying with the Central Powers and not switching sides. And it's theoretically possible Portugal could also be a Central Power as well. And so I leave you here.
Build some sort of coal
Caribbean and Central America.
coal line.
These two giant
Let's see.
Thank you for watching that video. If you enjoyed this content, please
So
subscribe,
we got this like
videos, comment, and like. And as always, thank you so much for watching and have a great day.
wall. Like I could wall this off, put turrets, it'd be fine. Wall this off, put turrets, it'll be fine.
And national income doubled. By 1936, the same year the Germans hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin,
Shut up.
I'm back. I got into history primarily when I was a child due to my love of mythology. However, the older I got, I became more interested in history since it seemed incredible that things nearly as awesome as Thor and Hercules, like the 100 Years' War and Stalin, actually happened. After all those years, history and mythology are still linked in really palpable ways. Even though we know werewolves and dragons don't exist, for example, they still did mean things to the societies that believed they existed. People were scared of certain monsters in certain eras since those monsters symbolized the structures in those societies and how they thought. You can understand a tremendous amount of how the past worked through looking at monsters. This video will look at history through the lenses of 10 different monsters to see what insecurities and things they symbolized, alongside looking for the real history behind them. Almost every myth has a grain of truth behind it, and so we'll be looking at why our ancestors often believed in things we find ridiculous today. Before we start, this video turned out weird as hell since I started making it, as it goes into so many weird realms like myth, psychology, etc. Also, much of the stuff I'm going to be talking about here happened thousands, if not tens of thousands of years ago, and I'm just going to make clear, a lot of this will turn out to be wrong with future scientific evolutions and is already pretty heavily contested. Well, time to get your silver bullets and cross, and make sure to always turn your head through this history of monsters. I really love reading. I read about 80 books a year and it's my favorite thing to do. One of my favorite ways to read is through Audible. An example, one of the best geopolitics books I've ever read I got on Audible, which is The Storm Before the Calm by George Friedman, which tries to predict what the state of the US will be across the 2020s. It covers how the US will go through a massive transition in both a political and an economic basis, which the author believes will be the roughest in American history. The good news, however, is that it's projected to have a golden age afterwards. This just scratches the surface of cool stuff I've listened to on Audible. Another example being Seeing Like the State by James Scott, which talks about how governments have purposely simplified the world and societies around them to make them more controllable over modern history. Audible is an app that allows you to download and listen to audiobooks. As a member, you get one book a month and there are countless titles on every topic. Also, you're open to the Plus catalog, which is all sorts of stuff like audiobooks, guided meditation, original entertainment, and podcasts. With all this going on, you should really check Audible out. To do so, use the special whatifalthist code, click the link in the description, visit audible/whatifalthist, or text whatifalthist to 500-500.
Alright.
Number 1. Coming from the last ice age, the Lord of the Beasts or the Sorcerer God. One of the weird things we've figured out at the prehistoric world is that it's perhaps more connected than we'd believe. We see eerily similar archetypal beliefs across all of Eurasia during the last ice age. Cave paintings in Europe, Indonesia, and Africa, and all over the world portray the same symbols repeated again and again. I wonder if this links to the theory that there's some sort of Proto-Eurasian language that we can see very faint traces from around 15,000, 17,000 years ago. In a cave painting in southern France, we saw this haunting portrait called the Sorcerer or the Lord of the Beasts. This is an archetypal figure that we see in lots of hunter-gatherer mythologies and paintings, or a certain god of animals that would release prey to humans when they pleased him. It was the job of the hunters to effectively honor the natural laws that allowed the animals to be released for them to hunt them, and when the god was displeased, there'd be starvation. The Lord of the Beasts likely served a role of humanizing the deep natural balances that humans had to follow in a hunter-gatherer ecosystem. The tribes that would overhunt in the short term would do worse in the long term than those that would hunt sustainably. Creating complex rites around proper procedure for hunting was a way of codifying biological systems that let humans survive in the long term without overexploiting the environment. However, as people moved towards farming, this sort of deity had less and less meaning and receded in importance to being a forgotten backdrop to other gods. Humans stopped viewing themselves as inextricably part of nature to instead viewing themselves as dominating nature. This god survived in a lot of ways in later mythologies. In basically all the Indo-European societies in the historic record, we see some sort of clearly descendant god like the Irish Cernunnos, the antlered god of the Hallstatt culture, and probably Greek Artemis. It seems likely from the archaeological record that the indigenous population of India and the Indus Valley civilization also had similar gods. It seems heavily likely that the wild hunt tradition coming out of northern Europe also dates back to this primordial tradition. Later references to God as well, whether with Abrahamic Yahweh, Zoroastrian Ahura Mazda, and Hindu Shiva, all hold some sort of reverence to the power that the Lord of the Beasts held. Thus, it's possible this deity is a deep, deep root for a lot of current religions. Number 2. Tiamat coming out of ancient Mesopotamia. In Babylonian mythology, there's a story about how the world started. Long story short, it's when the god of order Marduk slayed the giant saltwater dragon of chaos, which allowed stability for normal human life to form. Marduk and his sky chariot and lightning bolts crushed the dragon, freeing lots of water and destroying all our evil children. This story, which I've brutally simplified, but which we all perfectly understand, has a ridiculous amount of meaning behind it. People often treat this story as if it dates the dawn of time, and there probably are versions where it does, but the story as I told it was a pretty late introduction into Mesopotamian history. Every city in Mesopotamia, or the area corresponding to modern Iraq where civilization first formed, had a patron god that it operated in the name of. For example, Asur was the patron god of Assyria, and the temples often owned significant parts of the land and claimed to be their representations on Earth. The gods were treated as real people and were given offerings of food, sex, treasures, and rites to honor them. Marduk was the patron god of Babylon, and as the Babylonians became more powerful, they placed the belief in that Marduk was the greatest god as part of the religion that became gradually accepted. However, this was a popular story in some version across the whole of Eurasia. The tale of the powerful male, normally thunder god slaying the giant snake of chaos, manifests in Norse mythology with Thor and Jormungandr, in India with Indra and Vritra, or in Greece with Apollo and Python. But why? First of all, we as humans just don't like snakes. They were our top predators in the trees when we were apes, and even now they kill more people every year than every non-insect animal combined. Snakes thus are often representatives of everything that scares us. Secondly, in a culture like Mesopotamia's, the chaos the snake represented was terrifying. The way Mesopotamian society functioned was that large parts of the population worked around the clock to effectively keep the irrigation ditches working. This was since in a climate like Iraq's, if they didn't, everyone would starve. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are extremely brutal and unpredictable as well. Mesopotamia also faced an incredible amount of tax from every neighboring area. With all this going on, the way governance was justified in Mesopotamia was as a battle against chaos that would tear civilization apart, and the king was the representation of civilization holding everything together, making this myth quite popular among the elites. The snake symbolism is fascinating when paired with the Garden of Eden myth, where the common interpretation is that the Garden of Eden symbolizes the shift from hunter-gatherer to agricultural societies. This is since hunter-gatherer societies normally work far less, are healthier, and have a better diet, but switching to farming increased humanity's total abilities tremendously. In other words, by taking the fruit of knowledge in exchange for drudgery. Similarly, snakes are seen as wise in most hunter-gatherer cultures, and making the snake evil demonstrates interesting symbolism in that mankind had gone from working inside nature to the world of Marduk versus Tiamat in the Bible, where mankind was fighting against nature to maintain its crops against the ravages of rain, pests, and each other. Speaking of the Bible, this is basically the same story as the Leviathan in Revelation. The sky god, in this case Yahweh, crushes the giant ocean snake Leviathan. It's just that this takes place at the end of the world rather than the beginning. Also, as a side note, the scholarship is generally unified in the belief that the Leviathan was effectively a whale, given that the Hebrew
I
words
need
for
a
them are the
fucking
same, and the stories about
train.
shooting out jets of water make sense. Number 3. Nagas, fairies, dryads, and more. The Indo-Europeans are some of the greatest conquerors of all time, and very few people have heard of them. Around 2000 BC, they conquered a massive region stretching from Bengal to Ireland, spreading the languages that evolved into Russian, Hindi,
Eyeballs.
English, and Latin. Their conquests resulted in differing results in different regions. For example, largely committing genocide against the indigenous inhabitants of northern Europe, while intermarrying in India and southern Europe. In India, there were these mythical snake people called the Nagas. As the Aryan invaders of India drove into the jungle, they fought, interbred with, and made alliances with these snake people who were natives to the jungle. The theory now is the Nagas were representations of the pre-existing Dravidian inhabitants of forest India. These people worship snakes, with, in India, cobras growing to nearly 20 feet long, makes them terrifying and powerful creatures. There are similar theories that the fairies in Irish mythology are also representations of the pre-Indo-European population. Irish mythology holds that Ireland went through 6 different invasions, with the fairies being the indigenous inhabitants before the ancestors of the modern Irish arrived. Genetics bears out that Ireland has experienced many different migrations of people across its history, with most being bloody and horrific genocides. The stone weapons found in Ireland and the mounds constructed by the pre-Indo-Europeans were called fairy in Irish pagan culture. Fairies in traditional Irish culture were not the small beings we believe them to be now, but large stately creatures and were downgraded with Christianity towards being tiny and pathetic. We could draw similar connections with the other Indo-European mythic inhabitants like the elves in Norse mythology or the dryads in Greek or Roman. However, in some cases where the Indo-Europeans didn't become the ethnic majority like in Greece, we see evidence of the previous religion surviving. In Greek mythology, the Olympians, with some exceptions like Aphrodite, who was an introduction from Mesopotamian Ishtar, were of Indo-European extraction. However, then you get chaotic gods like Dionysus, the god of drinking, raving, and psychedelics, and everything else generally fun. Dionysus wasn't part of the Olympians, but his worship was a constant part of Greek history from beginning to end. Normal people would go to these raves, do drugs, and go insane for a night to get out of their minds. Many Greek city-states banned the Dionysian cult since it wasn't part of the state-prescribed Olympian religion, but Dionysus was almost certainly a survival of a pre-Indo-European religion. Side fun fact, from looking at statistical story analyses, we've found that a lot of classical fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel or Beauty and the Beast have to be at least 6,000 years old due to sharing deep Indo-European narrative roots. Number 4, some Greek myth rundowns. I started writing a bunch of different segments here about different ancient Greek monsters, and I realized I didn't have enough to cover any single one of them in a single section, but a bunch of interesting tidbits at a lot of them. The Amazons were almost certainly a derivation of the Scythians, or an Uranic people living around modern Ukraine where the Greeks traded with. We found from burials that the Scythians had some warrior women. The Greeks were a deeply patriarchal culture, and so found the idea of any women fighting horrifying, and that gradually evolved to tribes of just women warriors. The Centaurs, meanwhile, were the Thracians, a similar people to the Scythians living around modern Bulgaria, whose reputation as great horsemen mutated into being literal horsemen. The Cyclops are likely based off seeing the fossilized skulls of dwarf elephants on islands in the Mediterranean, which do actually look like the skulls of one-eyed giants. The Griffins are also probably based off seeing the dinosaur Protoceratops skulls in Central Asia, where the Griffins supposedly lived. Take Scylla or Charybdis also, or the sea monster and whirlpool monster that nearly killed Odysseus' fleet when he was sailing between Sicily and mainland Italy. Old sailing charts show that this strait used to have a large whirlpool in it that no longer exists, which would have made navigation difficult. The Minotaur was likely a representation of the bull cults that were deeply popular in the Bronze Age. I remember going to the Museum of Anatolian Civilization in Ankara and be like, oh my god, not another bull god. This probably derives from the Indo-Europeans who, as a herder people, were very much into cattle. The bull was a representation of male sexuality and power, with the cult of the bull being an important part of the Cretan Minoan court. The Minoan culture fell around 1300 BC, and then there was a lengthy Dark Age, and so by the time these myths crystallized around 800 BC, a lot of the previous civilization had just been forgotten. The ruins of the giant labyrinthine palace at Knossos might have been confused for an actual labyrinth, and all the bull memorabilia lying around might have resulted in people drawing a logical connection.
Did I do it again, dude?
Similarly,
Are you
Knossos sits on a
fucking kidding me?
volcanic fault line, thus resulting in making the ground actually make bull-like sounds from underground volcanic pressures. The bull cults survived for a while, with the coolest example being Mithraism during the Roman Empire, in which initiates to the mystery cult would be bathed in a bull's blood, which would be butchered on top of them in order to join the organization. The famous Oracle of Delphi sat on top of a massive fault line that resulted in creating fumes that acted sorta like psychedelics. The Oracle of Delphi also had one of the best intelligence networks in Greece as well, meaning her opinions were quite well informed. We actually forget this, but the Oracle of Delphi was hugely politically biased while claiming to be objective, almost like the New York Times today, and so it was controversial and a lot of her opinions were pushing political agendas. The oracles were originally teen girls, but they said too much dumb stuff, so they were replaced by older, better informed women. Number 5. The Dragon. So many cultures have some variation of the dragon. Whether with Quetzalcoatl in the Aztecs, the Piazza in North America, or dragons in China, Europe, the Middle East, hydras in the Congo, or the Beta serpent in Mauritania. The preoccupation with the giant serpent probably comes from the millions of years our ancestors were scared of reptiles. Similarly, we don't put tigers or lions in the same inhuman, terrifying space, since as mammals we can see that they have emotions and we can relate to them. The dragon represents the force of raw nature wherever it manifests, whether through controlling the waters in East Asia or by killing sheep in the West. Interestingly, in cultures in which people are consciously dependent upon water supplies like Mesopotamia and Iraq, dragons are worshipped as divine or near divine since humans are humbled by their dependency upon nature. Meanwhile, in the more herder-based cultures like those derived from the Indo-Europeans or Semites, dragons are treated like mega lions or tigers that have to be killed to protect the humans' flocks. Different kinds of dragons look very different around the world and are probably pulling from different natural sources. The Chinese dragon, before all the weird deer horn stuff is added on, looks an awful like the monitor lizards that inhabit southern China. Similarly, the dragons from Greek and Roman mythology look a lot like Central African pythons. The Romans have records of killing pythons around 40 feet long in North Africa, and the Romans drove the North African lion and elephant to extinction, so why not some big snakes as well? The North European dragon, or the one we're probably most familiar with, looks similar to dinosaur fossils found in Northern Europe. Similarly, the trait of fire-breathing among dragons seems to only exist in Northern Europe and to have spread outwards with the Germanic conquests. I've heard the interesting theory that this comes from underground regions that have natural gas combined with peat moss which burns easily, creating the myth of fire-breathing creatures which live underground with treasure. Number 6. Coming out of medieval Europe, the Bonacon. There was a myth in medieval Europe that Asia was inhabited by a species of cattle called the Bonacon. The catch was that they shot out fiery turds for defense. The truth is it was probably based off some form of Central Asian cattle that's known to have a somewhat active defecatory process. But it's crazy to see an era as good with records as medieval Europe generally was to distort something coming from not that far away from Central Asia. So what was happening here? This is part of a pattern where medieval Europe would distort things that would appear normal to us. Lemurs in Madagascar became an island of civilized dog-headed people. Rhinos in India became unicorns. The giraffe became a weird animal called the camel leopard. Ethiopia, a Christian country during the Middle Ages, became Prester John, a massive India-sized nation ruled by a mythological immortal king. Ironically, the Portuguese partially sailed to Asia to look for Prester John and use him as an ally